So we are seeing more and more YouTubers who are encouraging their viewers to buy land in the metaverse by comparing the situation that was faced in the 19th century, where someone basically that would have bought land at that stage would have made really, really high returns in today's price. So just to give you an example, the price per square feet in New York 100 years ago was about 142,000 times lower than today. So that means that if you would have bought land 100 years ago in New York, you would have made a return of basically 142,000 times your initial investment. So is virtual land the same as physical land? Can they be compared to each other? So for that, we will take a look at different things. We will break this down into the implications of building virtual land versus physical land. We will take a look at the regulatory aspects of physical land that play a huge role here from my perspective. And also we will try to come up with a conclusion. Are they similar? Can we expect similar returns, similar appreciation in virtual land than what we have experienced in physical land, as many YouTubers claim? So without further ado, let's dive into it. So the first thing we need to figure out is, why is traditional housing expensive? So as you can see here, there are multiple parties involved in the development of housing, in building new houses, and the ecosystem is very, very complex. So you can see here there is the landowners, the land developers, the brokers, there is the banks, construction lenders, but we will focus on three parties, and these are obviously the land developers. These are the parties that purchase land, parcels, and deal with regulations in order to make that land suitable for housing. Then we have home builders, which are the ones that design and build homes that can be sold to households. And then we have banks, obviously, that lend money to developers and home buyers. Obviously, we have the home buyers, that would be the fourth party, but let's try to find analogies with the virtual land. So for example, the land developers, maybe the decentraland or any other organization that is creating new virtual land would be the analogy here. Home builders, those would be home builder, to be honest, in the virtual land can be anyone. As we will see later on, you can very easily create new land. Obviously, there might be a point where you need maybe some software development, but in general, creating new land in the virtual land is super easy. And then we have banks that lend money to developers and home buyers. And I don't know if this will exist in the virtual land. I suspect that not many banks will be willing to lend money to someone that wants to spend $300,000 in virtual land because it's a very risky business. Now, a very, very important aspect that we shouldn't forget about when discussing housing prices is regulation and how this affects the housing market. So there are certain regulations that artificially prevent new homes from being built. The country where I'm from, for example, Spain, although here there is a lot of land, regulation keeps much of it from being available to build new homes. So that creates a pressure for prices to go up. For example, in the US, there are minimum lot size regulations that limit housing supply and increase housing costs. For example, this regulation prevents developers from mixing large and small lots together, and it requires that all these houses sit on a lot that is at least 9,000 square feet and will not issue the permits necessary to build a house on any lot smaller than 9,000 square feet. So this obviously makes housing more expensive than it would if there was no regulation. I'm not saying that these regulations don't make sense or are not necessary. One could argue that some of these regulations make sense in certain areas or situations where we want to keep consistency in aesthetics or I'm not getting into that, but the reality is that this increases housing costs. And basically, I don't see why this type of regulation should be built into virtual land, many of them, because they belong to the physical world, right? So maybe they exist and in the future and are necessary in the virtual land for whatever reason that I don't anticipate today. But the reality is that they don't exist today, and there is no reason for them to do so. So building physical homes is risky, uncertain, and there are many roadblocks along the way and regulations that increase the risk and uncertainty. So the process to build new homes will be something like the following steps. So first of all, developer buys the land or acquires an option to buy the land later. Then applies to the relevant government for permission to turn agricultural land into residential if that is necessary. The local government replies, either denying the request or granting it with certain conditions that could result in modifications to the initial design or to the initial proposal. So for example, they might grant the request subject to the condition that the developer builds less units than requested. There is then an environmental impact review too. If this is land that is turned into residential, it would require additional infrastructure costs, such as sidewalks, water, communications, etc., which are usually required to be developed or to be done by the developer. This is even before construction begins. Additionally, the steps above involves fees, lawyers, infrastructure costs. All this increases housing prices dramatically. And finally, all these costs is ultimately passed on to the consumer, to the home buyer. I can't hardly see all these regulations, or at least many of them, being part of the development of a home in a piece of land in, for example, the decentraland or wherever land is available. So effectively, these are large costs that physical housing incurs into, and virtual land doesn't, creating less pressure on the virtual land prices in the long term, beyond the speculative price that they have today. And then we have the actual construction costs. One could argue that virtual land incurs in software development costs, which is probably true in some cases, but this is a process subject to high degree of automation and cost reduction, especially something like building a virtual home. Housing is one of the industries that has been less impacted by technology advancements. It's extremely manual, and although there are many new technologies promising reducing its costs, the reality is that it relies heavily on human capital. This, again, is ultimately paid by the home buyer. You don't even have to be a software developer to build in the decentraland. I actually designed a small place in the decentraland with the builder quite quickly. Now, home developers also rely on other parties to build new homes, and this includes, for example, loans from banks to finance the new development. Banks, obviously, in turn, expect to get a return from these loans, and again, this cost is passed on to the buyer, onto the home buyer. If virtual land is so easy to build, it won't encourage such costs. And regulations not only affect building new homes, they also affect the prices of those homes that are already built and whose areas are impacted by the regulation. For example, if regulation makes it difficult to build in a certain area, supply shrinks in that area and prices tend to go up. So all in all, the only argument that I can see in favor of virtual land is the expectation that prices will go up in the future for certain pieces of land, much like the first NFTs became valuable for some investors. This is though very much like gambling. We just don't know how virtual land will be used in the future, if used at all, and which ones of these virtual lands will be valuable, if any. It is just pure gambling, and whoever thinks there is any point of comparison with physical land, it is just very confused about the whole topic.